First up, something I learned from my interest in traditional archery and making bows from scratch. If you take any given material, say timber or metal, of a given width, and you double that width, then it will become twice as strong. But if you take those original materials of the original width and instead double its thickness, then it will become 8 times as strong. This has large implications if we're trying to change the flexibility of something, say a hairspring. If we're trying to achieve this by reducing something's width, then we have to take off a relatively large amount. On the other hand, reducing something's thickness requires a much smaller removal of material for the same result. Hence, when making tweezers, the thickness of the material is reduced where you need it to bend. Maximum width is retained, though, in order to preserve lateral stiffness, so that the working ends stay in alignment in use. Since making the DIY tweezers video, I've blended the reduced area with the main parts, as well as removing a little more thickness. This has given a better feel, and it's now more an unconscious action of closing the tweezers rather than pushing them together. I made the pads to go back into the handle to increase stiffness when closing the jaws. Otherwise, under pressure, the ends of the jaws would spring. By placing your thumb and fingers over the extra length, they will remain parallel. The differing lengths of the pads is due to maker error, not for any deliberate reason. So here I'm using an antique pair of brass sliding tongs to securely hold the hairspring in. But it doesn't have to be this ornate. You could use a couple of small strips of wood with the hairspring in between and clamp them together with a couple of screws, just as long as whatever you use will hold the spring without damaging it. I've been practicing with my new tweezers and have curled and uncurled this end of the spring about 4 times, hence the slight wiggles already in it. So set yourself up so that you have about 5 centimeters or so of wire out the end of your clamp. Then, starting back a little bit, gently hold the wire in the jaws, roll your hand around 45 degrees or so, and pull the wire through them. Don't squeeze the jaws too tightly, as you don't want the spring catching in them and causing tiny kinks. Remember to keep the jaws at a right angle across the spring in order to minimize the risk of getting a conical spiral happening. The small bend at the end of the hairspring that allows it to go into the collet under the balance wheel I'll put in later. This wire is very resilient. I'm not applying any clamping force here, I'm just straightening up the spring like this, and as you can see, it snaps back into shape immediately. Feed some more wire out for curling the next part. Remember to pause and study what you've done after every stroke. Now, next to the tweezers, you can see that the curve is a little sharper, and that past that, a little shallower. So, by rolling the tweezers a little bit more or a little bit less as you're pulling the wire through, you can alter the curves. Okay, in slow-mo, I'm starting off with the tweezers fairly neutral. Now I'm increasing the roll to tighten the wire around it, and now I'm backing off that roll again in order to customize the curve. Now improving the blending. Letting the end of the spring fripp out of the tweezers is asking for it to get tangled. So in this next part, you'll see that things get quite out of center. So keep an eye on the tweezers as I roll them backwards and forwards to gently move the coils into their correct positions. Here I'm going to use the end of the hairspring as an indicator of when I need to change how much and in which direction I have to roll the tweezers. I'm letting a lot of this footage run at normal speed so you can study the ballet that happens between the tweezers and the spring. Okay, so we have got some conical spiraling going on here, both up and down. This is caused by the tweezers being at an angle and not perpendicular across the spring. With the jaws angled like this, as you pull the spring through them, you cause an upward spiral. And conversely, with the jaws angled like this, you cause a downward spiral. So in regards to the concentricity of the coils, it's come out quite well, and I think we can switch over to the regular tweezers to fine-tune them and deal with the conical aspect of it. An important thing to do is take measurements of the original hairspring, if you have it, and indeed the size of the balance collet, the placement and breadth of movement of the regulator, and the position of the stud in the top plate that takes the end of the hairspring. Then transfer these, life-size, to a piece of paper so that you can compare the spring to it as you're working on it. So here we have the maximum width of the hairspring and the width of the collet, and here marking the tail of the spring and the location of the stud on the top plate. Now, being a 1700s Verge, the regulator has quite a lot of travel to it, so I'm marking in its fast and slow limits. This outer curve of the spring needs to match the curve that the regulator will take so that the spring is at rest the whole time. If the curves don't match, then as you adjust the regulator, it will pull the coils off center, applying side loads to the pivots of the balance staff, inducing unwanted friction and wear. So our first task is to level all the coils and make it sit flat on the table. Now I have sped this up. The task of leveling all the coils and centering them took around 25 minutes, which I was actually very happy with. What you're looking for here is the last place where the spring is touching the tabletop. Then you're twisting the spring, like that, though that looks a lot scarier from your angle than it did from mine, to bend down the part that is lifted off the surface, little bit by little bit. Not having the tweezers too close together so as to avoid kinks. And yes, I do realize I did get a bit close sometimes. Don't rush yourself. Take it easy. Remember that this is at twice speed. It's not a race. In watchmaking, you do it until it is right. When you've done each adjustment, it's good to turn the spring around, carefully checking to see what stands out now. I came to the conclusion that the drawing was competing with the spring, so I paled it off a bit to make it easier to see what's going on. Feel free to play whatever your favourite hold music is in your head while watching this. So we're now getting close to it being flat from this side. Now I'm flipping it over, because when you get really close to things being level, just the weight of the spring will cause it to lay flat from one side. So you need to flip it over to change the weight distribution and let those areas spring up. Okay, happy with that. And now it's time to make all those coils concentric. Same deal here, little bit by little bit, and constantly changing where you're gripping the spring to avoid sharp bends. This looks a little savage. Maybe I'll show you a little bit of what it looks like in real time. You'll need to adjust your technique according to the strength of the spring you're working with. This is very springy metal. If this was like the one in the watch that I'm working on, yeah, could not do it like this. It would have folded up into a tangled mess. It was very, very soft. Here I'm bending the inner coil so that it will fit into the collet on the balance staff. So remember, when you're manipulating coils, whether moving them into an empty space or spreading them out, you're basically gripping them 90 degrees before or after the area you want to affect. Doing a quick check of the layout. Now it has ended up slightly conical on the underside, so we've just got to deal with that. So, some of you may have noticed that these two tweezers are slightly magnetic, and so I'm swapping out one of them for a brass pair I made a while ago. I'm in the process of making a mechanical demagnetizer, but it's not quite finished yet. Another check, and we can see that the outer coil is a little too tight. We'll need to open that up so that it lines up with the travel of the regulator and the location of the top plate stud. Well, that didn't go according to plan. Have to reverse it. Ah, the wonders of learning. As you get closer to things being correct, it can get harder and harder to spot the tiny irregularities that occur. Sometimes the best thing to do is to leave it for the day and come back the next with fresh eyes and mind. And we appear to have success, with everything lining up with the key points, though tomorrow I may think differently. So even though I was using a hypothetical layout for the hairspring in this tutorial, I will either be modifying this spring or use the remainder of the stock that I made to make a spring for this pocket watch, which I've been working on for some time. The regulator's dismantled at the moment, so I'm afraid that's not there. The hairspring you can see under the balance here is the first successful one that I made. Although it's a bit on the thin side, hence it had to be shortened to 2¼ turns in order to get the correct beat frequency. With it, the watch can keep within a minute or two a day. The original hairspring was about 3½ turns, but it had obviously been broken at some time in its life, as, even set at its maximum length, it would gain 15 minutes per hour, or 6 hours per day, and I couldn't make it go any slower. So I'm looking forward to fitting an even better spring to it soon. And that is the end of this series on hand making a Verge hairspring. I hope it was informative, and thanks for sitting through it all. Cheers.